Welcome back to Case of Interest Kohberger. I'm Stacey Lang. This is our web series where we take an in-depth look at the University of Idaho murder case and the prosecution of suspect Brian Kohberger. This is a story that captivated national interest back on November 13th of 2022 when those 4 University of Idaho students were murdered in their off-campus home in Moscow, Idaho. Then about 6 weeks later, it became a story, a case that had great local interest to us here in northeastern and central Pennsylvania when a native of Monroe County, Pennsylvania, Brian Kohberger, was arrested for those 4 homicides. He is currently awaiting trial in Idaho. Since we last spoke, we talked about the grand jury indictment that came down on May 16th, indicting him again on those 4 counts of first-degree murder. And now for this episode, we're going to look forward to another set of hearings that are scheduled for tomorrow in Latah County Court in Moscow, Idaho. Tomorrow is Friday, June 9th. There are 2 hearings that we're looking forward to. One at 1:30 our time, that's Eastern Standard Time, and one then at 4:30 Eastern Standard Time. We'll have coverage of those hearings when they happen tomorrow, but some of the court filings leading up to those hearings give us an idea of what we're going to see. Both of those hearings have to do with the gag order in this case, something that we've been talking about a lot. Shortly after Kohberger's arrest on December 30th, prosecutors in Latah County asked the judge to place a non-dissemination order, or gag order as it's more commonly known, over all prosecutors, defense attorneys, law enforcement officials, and then even the victims' families in this case. And the thought here is to keep them from speaking to the media and preserving a jury pool that could then work on the trial against Brian Kohberger. But there are 2 groups working against that gag order. One of those is a coalition of media groups that includes our parent company, Tegna, as well as some major broadcasting, print, and radio journalists that are part of this coalition of media. And then there's another fight against the gag order that's actually being led by one of the victims' families. That victim, Kaylee Gonzalez, her family and an attorney are fighting to have the gag order vacated in this case so they can have an opportunity to speak publicly about Kohberger's prosecution. So both of those groups will go in front of a county judge. If this sounds familiar, it's because the Supreme Court already heard these arguments from these 2 groups a few weeks ago, but the Supreme Court in Idaho kicked it back down to the local judge to make a decision about whether or not to vacate this gag order. So we're going to take a look at the Idaho Judicial Cases of Interest page, which a link will make available to you on WNEP.com. And this is where we get all of the documents that we go through here. And we're looking at the state of Idaho versus Brian Kohberger. You can see since his arrest in December how much stuff has been filed since that happened. And there was quite a bit that was posted just within the last couple of days from last Friday on in preparation for this hearing. And these filings give us a little bit of a roadmap as to how these arguments are going to go tomorrow, Friday, in court. Now, you can tell by the filings that the attorneys representing that coalition of media are trying to paint a picture that the gag order in this case is being used too broadly. I'm going to take your attention to the top links here. These are all written testimonies that were submitted to the court ahead of that hearing from a bunch of different journalists. Some of them from local stations, some from national media. Sorry, I just jumped up real quick. If you're taking a look at these names, if you're a true crime fan, you might recognize this name. Anjanette Levy was featured in the Netflix documentary Making a Murderer. And she now works for the Law and Crime Network. And she gives a testimony about how she's been affected by the gag order. The next couple of names are from our sister station King, King, in Seattle, Chris Ingalls and Erica Zucco. I want to show you Chris's testimony because it ties back to law enforcement here in Pennsylvania. He writes in this that he's an investigative reporter for King TV in Seattle, and he writes to provide fair and accurate reporting of information that would be valuable to the communities impacted by the murders, I asked Major Christopher Paris of the Pennsylvania State Police whether law enforcement had launched any review of unsolved cases that could be linked to Mr. Kohberger. Major Paris declined to answer my question, stating that he was bound by the gag order issued in this case. So I think they're kind of setting up here what lines they may think that some law enforcement are crossing to apply that gag order too broadly, and what pieces of information are relevant to the public at this point in the prosecution. The next one comes from a reporter from the Idaho Statesman, and she, I'll just summarize what she writes here, but she says that she asked the University of Idaho Moscow Police Department about the size of Moscow's jail and the size of Mr. Kohberger's cell. Details that the Moscow Police Department would not answer because of the gag order. So I'm guessing that the attorneys are going to argue that this should be public knowledge whether or not there's a gag order in this case, the size of the jail in Latah County and the size of a cell within that jail. Let's take another look here at this list of documents that were filed ahead of these gag order hearings. There are a number of them from Kohberger's attorney, Ann Taylor, that help to show what arguments they're going to make. Their position has long been to keep that gag order in place in order to preserve a jury pool. So one of the motions filed here, let me see if I have the right one. I might not. Yes, I do. Ann Taylor is asking the judge to, ahead of this hearing, take a look at a couple of news reports. Doesn't specifically say why, but I think we can presume it's going to be because she's going to point out areas where there is media bias or information that might skew a jury pool. And these are articles all from national entities, the U.S. Sun, Fox News, New York Post, CNN, I think the Daily Mail is in there, yes, and Newsweek. And then there's this other document. If you have time to read it, it's really interesting, is the objection to media's motion to vacate the non-dissemination order. Again, non-dissemination is the fancy way of saying gag order. And this 58-page document lays out a lot of the arguments for keeping the gag order in place. And I found a couple paragraphs that really drive home the point. This passage here on page 5 is talking about the NBC Dateline special that aired just days after the grand jury indictment on May 16th. And Ann Taylor writes, using the same playbook the media has chosen throughout this case, the special gets details of the investigation wrong, despite access to the arrest affidavit. It chooses to treat Mr. Kohberger as already guilty, asking multiple, in quotes, experts to speculate as to how and why he committed the murders without once asking if the police have the right person. And it provides audiences with made-up evidence of Mr. Kohberger's character that will never be seen inside of courtroom. It even had a, quote, leak just a little over 2 weeks after the media claimed there were none. The upshot of this and similar media stories is a constant feedback loop of people crying out for Mr. Kohberger's blood. One of those that now leads the pack happens to be a lawyer who has inserted himself into the case, Mr. Gray. And Mr. Gray is referring to attorney Shannon Gray, who is representing the Gonzalez family in this fight to have the gag order vacated. So I'm sure we'll hear from him in one of those 2 hearings that are scheduled for Friday, June 9th. Again, we'll have coverage of those hearings on Newswatch 16 and on WNEP.com. And we, of course, will be watching, and it will be something that we cover on later editions here on Case of Interest Kohberger. We don't know when the judge is going to come to a decision. Will he do it immediately, or will he give it a few days to consider the testimony that's presented? We don't know. But either way, we'll be paying attention, and we'll break it all down here. Thanks for joining us.